This program is brought to you by RTS on iTunes U from the Distance Education Department of Reformed Theological Seminary. For more information on RTS degrees and programs, please visit us at www.rts.edu or call 1-855-854-6920.
All right, for the next part of the course, I want to focus on the philosophy of logical analysis. I've emphasized to you in the past that the 20th century is the century of language. And we've seen that through a number of philosophical schools already. We've seen that with Heidegger, who said that language is the house of being, who said that reality reveals itself to me through language, by means of language. We've seen that through Saussure and Saussure's followers, who were professional linguists but came to see the science of linguistics as indicating a structural similarity between all human minds. And we saw the deconstructionists who denied that there was that kind of continuity between all the different human minds. And so, we've seen Gadamer, we've seen other people who have a lot to say about hermeneutics and about how hermeneutics can tell us a lot about the way the world is, not only the way language is. So the idea is to try to understand the world through language, to try to solve the old philosophical problems by referring to language. Where does this emphasis come from? Well, it comes partly out of frustration, I think, with the continual inability of philosophers to solve problems which have been known for hundreds of years. This is kind of an embarrassment to the philosophical community, you know. Astronomy has made a lot of progress since the time of Ptolemy down to the present day. Physics has made a lot of progress. Chemistry has made a lot of progress. But what about philosophy? In a way, philosophy has made no progress. That's the great embarrassment. All the problems that Plato and Aristotle talked about in philosophy are still problems today. None of them have been definitively solved. Opinions have changed, and new arguments have been found, and new concepts have been developed, and technical terms have been developed. But in a way, we're just back to where we were. Can't really say that Plato knew any more or any less about philosophy than Bertrand Russell or Ludwig Wittgenstein or somebody in our century. So it may be that all of this has generated some frustration. And one of the things that you do when you're frustrated is you look around to try to find some new way of dealing with your problems. And I think a lot of philosophers have said, well, maybe our problems are the result of misunderstandings. Let's define our terms. That is, let's pay closer attention to language. I think the focus on language may be partly due to that, but it also may come from a more profound observation, namely that language is a kind of gateway to reality. Remember, we've talked about, I think the first day that we were together, I mentioned my triad of metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, and how you can't, you can start with any one of the three, but if you start with metaphysics, you're going to have to focus on epistemology eventually, and if you focus on epistemology at the beginning, well, you'll have to give some attention to ethics and so on. So these are not really separable, but the interesting thing is that you have three entrances to philosophy. You can start with metaphysics, you can start with epistemology, you can start with ethics. But now, I think what they've discovered in the 20th century is you can also start with language, okay? And instead of saying with Hegel that the real is the rational and the rational is the real, you can say something like this: the real is the sayable, and the sayable is the real. What we can express in language, that's what reality is. And what we can't express in language, that has to be excluded from the realm of reality. So nothing can be said to exist unless it can be spoken of. Anything which can be spoken of has some sort of reality. And if language is a key to determining what is metaphysics, it's also a key to determining what is knowable, epistemology, and what is right, ethics. So modern thinkers have placed unique emphasis on the study of language. Now this approach is not entirely new with the 20th century. Plato, for example, when he asked questions like, what's the nature of justice? He didn't go around with a flashlight, with a lantern like Diogenes looking for a just man. Rather, he talked about the word justice. When do we use the word justice? What does the word mean? What does it include and what does it exclude? A lot of Plato's dialogues are examples of linguistic analysis. And Aristotle, in a slightly different way, we can say the same thing about him. Aristotle developed his metaphysics largely on the basis of a certain kind of grammar. What is a substance? Well, a substance is what can fit into the subject position of a sentence. So dogs have 4 legs. Well, dogs are substances. They're in the subject slot. 4 legs, well, that's a predicate. And so you have the subject and you have the predicate. You have the subject and you have the attribute. You have the subject and you have the qualities or the modifiers. And so Aristotle developed his metaphysics in a way that fit the grammatical structure of Greek sentences. So it's possible that there are other ways of using language to illuminate philosophical concepts, and some of them have been suggested in the last century or so. Well, in the first 50 years of the 20th century, say from 1900 to 1960, let's say, make it 60 years, there have been basically 3 schools of thought in Anglo-American language philosophy. Now, notice that title that I used. I said Anglo-American language philosophy. Remember, some time ago I said that the English Channel not only divided the continent of Europe from the island of Britain, but the English Channel was also a major division in philosophy. So that people on one side of the English Channel, for one period of time, people on one side of the channel were rationalists, and on the other side of the channel they were empiricists. And that happened to a large extent throughout the history of philosophy. That's also been the case in the 20th century. In the 20th century, existentialism, structuralism, hermeneutics are movements that largely occurred on the continent of Europe, whereas logical atomism, logical positivism, logical or ordinary language philosophy are movements that largely occurred in the English-speaking world. Now, we talked about existentialism and structuralism earlier in the course. Right now, I'm going to begin talking about what was going on in the English-speaking world at about the same time. Very different kind of philosophy, but still concerned with language. That's the interesting thing. There's a commonality as well as a distinctiveness. Well, what was going on in England then? 3 kinds of language analysis philosophy. Very good text that you can read on this is by J.O. Urmson, U-R-M-S-O-N, called Philosophical Analysis. And he distinguishes three different philosophical schools that can be called language analysis. The first school is called logical atomism, second school is called logical positivism, and the third school is called ordinary language philosophy. Let's begin with logical atomism. Here we're thinking of the early thought of Bertrand Russell. You see his dates, lived to be almost 100, 1872 to 1970. And Ludwig Wittgenstein. I'm going to be saying a lot about Wittgenstein in our course here, and he went through several phases in his thought. But what happened was that Russell was teaching philosophy, and this young kid from Austria, Ludwig Wittgenstein, came to study with him at Cambridge, and Wittgenstein came to study aeronautical engineering, but he had a bent toward philosophy, and so he brought Russell a paper that he had written, and he said, "Mr. Russell, if I'm a complete idiot, then I will become an aeronautical engineer. If I'm not a complete idiot, I would like to be a philosopher." And Russell took one look at his paper and said, "My dear young man, you must not become an engineer." Russell noticed almost immediately that Wittgenstein was a profound philosophical mind, and certainly Wittgenstein became Russell's best student, much as Aristotle was Plato's best student. So they worked together, and in this first phase of language philosophy, which I'm calling logical atomism, Russell and Wittgenstein developed their own view, which was more or less the same between the two of them. Russell, in 1911, published together with Whitehead, and remember we talked about Whitehead as the father of process philosophy, but before Whitehead became a process philosopher, he worked with Russell. And in 1911, Russell and Whitehead produced together a volume called Principia Mathematica, Principles of Mathematics. This was a groundbreaking treatise in logic and mathematics, which unveiled a remarkably fruitful new approach in these disciplines. It was different from, it was a new logic, basically. Aristotle had more or less invented logic in his time, and there hadn't been a whole lot of changes in the science of logic since the time of Aristotle. William of Ockham added some things in the medieval period. There are a few things that came in the 19th century, but Russell's logic was really a groundbreaking treatise. It differed somewhat from Aristotle's and so on. One way of understanding the difference between Aristotle's logic and Russell's logic is to say that Aristotle's logic dealt with terms, where Russell's logic dealt with propositions. In Aristotle's logic, you get syllogisms like this: all A is B, all B is C, therefore all A is C. And A, B, and C are variables, and they stand for terms. They stand for things. They stand for quantities. They stand for objects of some kind. In Russell's logic, it looks very different. In Russell's logic, you would have you could have the same argument, all one thing is something else, but the way Russell would put it is, for all occasions, if this is true, if A is true, then B is true. If B is true, then C is true, and if A is true, then C is true. But the A's, B's, and C's don't represent things, they represent propositions. So if it rains, the picnic is canceled. Each variable stands for a proposition rather than an object or a thing. And that has interesting ramifications if you go into the philosophy a little bit. Well, it occurred to Russell that the system of the Principia reflected the structure of the world in an important way. I'll get to that in a moment. And therefore, the structure of the Principia provided the opportunity to start a new philosophy, a new approach to philosophy. Now, Russell worked, as I said, with Ludwig Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein was born to a wealthy and tragic family. Three of his brothers, I believe, committed suicide. The fourth brother lost an arm in the war, but he was a pianist, and so he became, after World War I, he became a one-armed pianist. Ravel wrote the piano concerto for the left hand for Paul Wittgenstein. But all kinds of, Wittgenstein had a very interesting biography, very brilliant, very precocious, and in collaboration with Russell, or as a student of Russell, he wrote a book called the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, which was published in 1918. The title is kind of a takeoff on Spinoza's Tractatus Theologico-Politicus. Spinoza wrote a book called Theological Political Treatise, and Wittgenstein's book was Logical Philosophical Treatise. So he developed, he followed out what Russell was thinking to develop a philosophical system based on the structure of the Principia Mathematica. Now, here's some of the ideas in Russell's Tractatus. In Wittgenstein's Tractatus. First, the so-called picture theory of language. Wittgenstein believed that the way to gain knowledge in metaphysics is to develop a language, a pure language, a language purified by Russell's logic, which would then be a picture of the world, okay? Every sentence in that language would correspond to a fact in the world. Now, it's important that we talk about facts here. The very first sentence in Wittgenstein's Tractatus is this. He says, the world is the totality of facts, not things, okay? That's his opposition to Aristotle. Aristotle, if you'd ask Aristotle what the world is made up of, Aristotle would have said substances, things, okay? People and rocks and trees and animals and so on, so substances. Wittgenstein and Russell believed that that's not a very good way to describe the universe. Because if you just list the substances in the universe, if you list everything in the universe, you're going to miss some important elements. Let's say that, just for the sake of argument, let's assume that there are three things in the universe, A, B, and C. Aristotle would say, if you say to Aristotle, describe the universe, he would say A, B, and C. But if you ask Russell or Wittgenstein to describe the universe, they would say, well, A, B, and C, huh? Well, we need to know more. We need to know where they are. We need to know how they're related to one another. We need to know whether A is beside B, or A is on top of B, or A is caused by B, or what is the relationship there? In other words, we need to know not only the things, we need to know the properties and the relationships of the things. We need to know how the things are related to one another. Another way of saying that is, we need to know not just the things, we need to know the facts. A thing would be book. The fact would be the book is on the table. We express things by nouns. We express facts by clauses and sentences. So for Russell, if you just list the things, there's a lot that you don't know. But if you list the facts, that gives you the things, and it shows you how all the things are related to one another. So Wittgenstein's position is that the universe is the collection of facts, not the collection of things. And that, of course, ties in with Russell's logic, because Russell's logic is a logic of propositions, not terms. Terms designate things, propositions designate facts. So in Russell's logic, you're talking about facts. In Aristotle's logic, you're talking about things. So Wittgenstein is interested in developing a view of the world in which the world is the collection of facts. The book is on the table. That's one fact. Giraffes are taller than chimpanzees. That's another fact. Let's get all the facts together, and once we list all the facts and list them in a perfect language, then we will have an adequate picture of the universe. So you see all the relations there. Every sentence would correspond to a fact in the world. Every word in every sentence would correspond to an element of a fact. Now, facts consist of things, properties, and relations. Okay? A fact always says that A is related to B, or A has property B, or something like that. So every word of the perfect language would represent an element of the fact. Every sentence would correspond to a fact in the world. Then to purify our ordinary language, we must make sure that every sentence corresponds to only one fact. Now, in ordinary language, of course, our sentences often correspond to a lot of facts, right? And we have simple sentences, we have compound sentences, we have a sentence like the book is on the table and the table is brown. That describes two facts. So Wittgenstein, in order to get a language that's a perfect picture of the world, he has to make sure that every sentence reflects one fact and only one fact. So we have to reduce the complex sentences to simple sentences, reduce compound sentences to simple sentences, reduce statements about generalities like happiness and greenness to statements about individual sense data. The wall is blue. I'm looking at a wall, and the wall is blue. Well, that's a generalization, right? That doesn't describe only one fact. Of course, that's a generalization because that sums up my sense experiences over a period of several seconds. So I need to say sense experience now, sense experience A, sense experience B, sense experience C. In other words, there has to be a sentence in the perfect language for every sense experience that I have. In the end, the perfect language consists of momentary sense experiences then. Or take a sentence like England declared war. That sounds like a simple sentence, but it's really a summary of a great many things. It really says Parliament did this, and the Queen did this, and the soldiers did this, and so on and so forth. A whole lot of things that go into England declaring war. So if you're going to transform that into a sentence in the perfect language, you have to draw out all of the individual facts that are stated by that generality. And so in the end, as I say, the perfect language consists of momentary sense experience, this read now, and so on. But questions arise, is that really a picture of the world? Has anyone ever seen a sense datum in this sense? Are these really the fundamental building blocks of experience? I mean, if I'm trying to describe the wall, and I break it down into individual sense experiences, and I say, blue patch now. Do I ever see a momentary, sense datum of a blue patch? I don't think so. I mean, I see a wall, and I have an extended experience of that wall. And if I try to break it down into momentary sense experiences, then I'm doing something artificial. I'm doing something abstract. I'm doing something that I imagine that I've experienced. I'm not describing my actual experience. But anyway, this is what Wittgenstein thought had to be done if you're going to have a perfect language. Well, what happens if there's something that you're trying to talk about, but it can't be talked about in the perfect language? What if you can't translate what you want to say into reports of momentary sense experiences? Well, if you can't do that, then you have to confess that it's meaningless. It can't be spoken of. It has to be eliminated from the perfect language. So this is a way of determining what is meaningful and what's not meaningful, and what exists and what doesn't exist. Because nothing can exist unless it can be said. Nothing can exist unless it can be expressed in the perfect language. Now, look at epistemology on the next page here. Only that is knowable which can be translated into the perfect language. Anything else is unknowable because it's unspeakable. So there are some things that you can't translate into the perfect language. For example, ethics. Right and wrong. I say stealing is wrong. How do I translate that into the perfect language? I can't reduce that to a sense experience. Wrong is not something that you can sense. It's not something that you can see or hear or taste. So how can I say stealing is wrong in the perfect language? And in one sense, I can't, all right? And so Wittgenstein is willing to bite the bullet. He's willing to say, okay, you can't translate it into the perfect language, therefore it can't be sayable, therefore it can't be knowable, therefore it's in one sense meaningless. But that bothered Wittgenstein. I mean, Wittgenstein actually believed in right and wrong. He was somewhat sensitive on ethical matters, and he often wrote about ethical matters. So what can be said about that? Well, he kind of developed a grab bag. He developed a category, kind of like a wastebasket, for putting things in that wouldn't measure up to the standards of the perfect language. Wittgenstein knew that ethics, he felt in his heart that ethics was meaningful. And yet in his theory, ethics came out looking meaningless. So he didn't want that result. So he said that ethical right and wrong was mystical. Okay, he used the term das Mystische. There are some things, he says, that are real, but they cannot be said, meaning they can't be transformed into the perfect language. They can't be said. So anything that we feel ought to be known, but we can't say it, we call it mystical. We call it das Mystische. Das Mystische is almost like Kant's noumenal world, okay? Kant, felt very strongly that the doctrine of God was an important concept. But Kant was convinced that you could not find God in the phenomenal world. So if God exists in the noumenal world somewhere, and God has to be a regulative concept, not a constitutive concept. Now, Wittgenstein does something very similar with God and with ethics. Ethics is important. He doesn't want to just say that ethics is meaningless, but it doesn't fit into the perfect language. So, so Wittgenstein puts it into the category that he calls das Mystische, or the mystical. What about religion? What about God? Well, Wittgenstein was not a religious believer, but he had an interest in religion. At one time, he was a gardener in a monastery. He sometimes took an interest in religious matters. And he wasn't quite ready to say that religion was a lot of nonsense, the way some people will see when we talk about logical positivism. They were ready to say that religion is a lot of nonsense, but not Wittgenstein. So Wittgenstein, but the trouble is you cannot reduce God to momentary sense data. You can't sense God. You can't see God. You can't hear God. So you can't reduce statements about God to reports of sense data. Therefore, you can't reduce statements about God to a perfect language understood in the terms of Russell and Wittgenstein. So what are you going to do? Well, again, Wittgenstein says the concept of God is mystical. He used the sentence, he says, God does not reveal himself in the world. Well, there was one writer who said that Wittgenstein was close to the kingdom there. The writer said that Wittgenstein was acknowledging God's transcendence, that God was above the world, and so on and so forth. I don't think that's what Wittgenstein was saying. I think that Wittgenstein was saying is that if you're in the world, there is no evidence for God. There is no way of sensing God or seeing God. And so therefore we can only suppose God by an act of kind of blind faith and suppose that he exists up there in the mystical world, okay? But, you know, if you get rid of ethics, or if you turn ethics into mysticism, and if you turn God into mysticism, what about philosophy? Now, God, the soul, I didn't mention the soul, but the soul too, God, the soul of the world, are beyond the scope of the perfect language. And by the way, that's similar to Kant's noumenal again. I mean, Kant put God, the soul, and the world as a whole together in the noumenal world. But what about philosophy? Now, philosophy, here Wittgenstein is thinking that philosophy can give us some insights into the relationship between language and the world. But he discovers, as he develops his thesis, that that's exactly what philosophy cannot do. The perfect language can picture facts, but the perfect language cannot picture relationships between language and facts. Wittgenstein comments that the eye is not part of its own field of vision. So the philosopher cannot, if language is like the eye, then we can't describe language while we're talking about the facts. We can only talk about the facts in the perfect language. We can't talk about the relationship between the language and the facts. But that's exactly what Wittgenstein is trying to do in his book. So there's something wrong with his book. And he begins to get suspicious of that. There are a lot of other things, of course. A perfect language cannot speak of what is possible or what is impossible, but he's been trying to do that too in his book. Well, to make a long story short, number 4, Wittgenstein recognizes that most all philosophy, including that of the Tractatus itself, violates his own restrictions. So the Tractatus has to be rejected as meaningless. The statements in the Tractatus are useful only as tools to bring us to the point where we stop asking senseless questions. So the book, in a way, is self-refuting. The book has tried to show us the relationship between language and the world, but it concludes that you can't show the relationship between language and the world within the scope of the perfect language. So the book says basically that the book is impossible. But what Wittgenstein does, in a way, is to relegate the whole book to the mystical sphere. There's this very famous ending paragraph. He says, "My propositions," that is the propositions of the book, "are elucidatory in this way. He who understands me finally recognizes them as senseless when he has climbed out through them, on them, over them. He must, so to speak, throw away the ladder after he has climbed up on it. He must surmount these propositions, then he sees the world rightly. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof must one be silent." Now, this is in the mystical tradition. This is what the actual medieval mystics said. They said, well, okay, we've shown you the importance of rational thought, but rational thought will only get you somewhere so far. And rational thought can get you to the point where you need to have a mystical union with God or with the object of your study. And when you reach that point of a mystical union, you get beyond reason, and you can throw reason away. Reason is like a ladder that you climb up to reach the heights. But once you've reached the height, you don't need the ladder anymore, and you can throw it away. And now we find Wittgenstein saying the same thing about his perfect language. He thinks that he starts off rationalistically, trying to show you exactly what the criteria are for a perfect language, and then he ends up in irrationalism because he determines that this perfect language can't tell you anything at all, that it fails on its own criteria, that it's self-contradictory, self-refuting, and so when you get to the top of the mountain, you throw away the perfect language, and you relegate all of this to the area of mysticism. That's the early Wittgenstein. That's Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. And we'll see what happens after this. The interesting thing is the last sentence of this book, whereof one cannot speak, thereof must one be silent. Wittgenstein has decided that the things he's tried to speak on can't be spoken about, and almost literally he is silent for the next 10 years. He leaves the discipline of philosophy. He goes traveling in Europe where nobody can find him. He resigned his position at Cambridge, and he went off and did a number of interesting things. He designed a house for his sister. He worked as a gardener in a monastery for a while. For a long time, the philosophers were interested in talking to him because his book caused something of a sensation, but they had an awful hard time finding him, and Wittgenstein didn't want to talk to philosophers. Well, while he was gone, and we're going to see later that he comes back on the scene in a different context, but while Wittgenstein is gone, a new movement springs up. And the second movement is called logical positivism. Logical positivism was developed by a group of scientists and philosophers originally in Vienna, but this spread to the city of Berlin eventually a number of these people moved from Europe to England and America in order to escape from Hitler. A number of them were Jewish. And so they were called logical positivists. You notice some of the names there: Rudolf Carnap, Moritz Schlick, Karl Hempel, whom I studied with at Princeton, Herbert Feigl, A.J. Ayer, who was an Englishman and tried to popularize some of this philosophy. Well, these Viennese scientists and philosophers were very interested in Wittgenstein's Tractatus because they liked the idea of a type of philosophy in which you stick to the facts, where you say the only thing that exists are facts, and then you try to express those facts by means of language. But they didn't like Wittgenstein's mysticism. They didn't quite understand it, I think, and so they wanted to come up with a philosophy that was more common sense, that that didn't lead into paradoxes, that was not self-refuting. Of course, everybody wants a philosophy that's not self-refuting. And in order to do that, they adopted some of the ideas and messianic pretensions of a movement of the late 19th century called Positivism. That movement was led by a Frenchman named Auguste Comte. Comte believed that society went through three stages. Where have we heard that before? Kind of a Hegelian dialectic. There was the religious stage, and then there was the metaphysical stage when people start thinking rationally, and then there's the scientific stage, or what Comte called the positive stage. And so this is the inevitable progress of history, according to Comte, that people moved from religion to kind of metaphysical philosophy as a means of understanding the world, and then they came to abandon that metaphysical philosophy in favor of science. So Comte argued that science was really the only way of understanding the world, and religion was bogus, and metaphysics was bogus. So the logical positivists, these Viennese scientists around the 1920s, 1930s, developed a view that they called logical positivism. What this has in common with Comte is that science is the way of knowing things, and there is no other method than science. What good is philosophy then? Well, philosophy analyzes the language of science. So again, we have a kind of language philosophy here. But the only way of knowing, understanding facts is scientific method, and the only purpose of philosophy is to analyze the language of scientific method. This leads to certain revisions of logical atomism. First, the logical positivists denied the so-called picture theory of language. Remember, in logical atomism, they tried to come up with a language which is a perfect picture of the world. And the positivists rejected this. They said language has a number of uses, but the purpose of language is not to picture the world. When you think about it, the idea of language picturing the world is a little silly. I mean, the word mouse doesn't look like a mouse. So they were pretty good to get rid of that. Language need not to be a perfect picture of the world. And secondly, they rejected the metaphysics, not only the metaphysics of Descartes and Leibniz and so on, but the metaphysics of Wittgenstein's Tractatus. Remember, Wittgenstein's Tractatus is a very metaphysical book. Started off by making a metaphysical statement. The world is a collection of facts, not things. That is a very metaphysical outlook. That's very different from Aristotle. Remember, we compared Aristotle's view that the world is a collection of things to Wittgenstein's view that the world is a collection of facts. Well, so the Tractatus attempts to be metaphysical, and it has to be, because you're going to show the relation between language and the world. You have to have some understanding of the world. So the Tractatus is a very metaphysical book, but the logical positivists reject that. They reject all metaphysics, including that of the Tractatus. And they say that philosophy does not have any special way of discovering facts in the world. Philosophy doesn't have any way of telling you the structure of the world that's unavailable to other disciplines. The task of philosophy then is simply to analyze and clarify the language of science. Well, to look at logical positivism in a little more detail, they distinguished 4 different kinds of language, all right? The first kind of language is the tautology. Tautology is language, would be a sentence like, the chair is a chair, or either it will rain tomorrow or it will not. Now, those sentences are true simply by definition of the words. We know that these sentences are true just by knowing the meanings of the words. If you know the meaning of chair, you know that a chair is a chair. If you know the meaning of rain, if you know the meaning of tomorrow, if you know the meaning of either or, if you know the meaning of not, then you know that it's true, that either it will rain tomorrow or it will not. You may not be a weather forecaster, you may not have meteorological knowledge, but you know at least one thing that you're sure of, okay? Don't need any expertise at all. One thing that you're sure of is that either it will rain tomorrow or it will not. So tautologies are always true. You know that they're true. You don't need to have any research or expertise. You don't need to make any observations. You just know that they're true by virtue of the meanings of the words. Now, sort of the opposite of a tautology is the contradiction. Example of a contradiction would be, it is raining and it is not. Or Washington is the capital of the United States and it is not. Now, often we use expressions like that in a kind of ironic way, using paradox as a literary device, as a figure of speech, in order to indicate subtle relationships. In one sense it is, in another sense it isn't. But if you mean this literally, not meaning it ironically, not meaning it as a figure of speech, if you mean it just literally, to say that Washington is the capital of the United States and Washington is not the capital of the United States, to just say those two things together lands you in a contradiction, okay? And a contradiction cannot be true. A contradiction must be false, all right? So just as a tautology must be true, a contradiction must be false. Now, there's a third kind of language that is not always false and it's not always true. Take the sentence, the back fence is white. Now, you can know the meaning of back and fence and white and is, but knowing the meanings of the terms won't help you to know the truth of that statement or its falsity. You don't know the truth or the falsity of that statement by the meanings of the terms. In order to know whether that statement is true or false, you have to go out and look, or you have to have reliable testimony, or you have to have reliable information. That statement may be true or it may be false, but you find out by looking, you find out by getting evidence, you find out by getting testimony. So you have to go out in the back fence and by the back fence and investigate, is the back fence white or not? The positivists call these empirical statements. Remember empiricism? Empiricism is the view that sense experience is the foundation of human knowledge. Well, these are empirical statements, presumably derived from sense experience. If not my own sense experience, then somebody's sense experience. And the positivists said that empirical statements are the only statements which are capable of conveying information, all right? Either it will rain tomorrow or it will not. Well, that may sound like it's conveying information, and I think it does convey information in a certain way, but the positivists would say, no, that doesn't really convey information because sense experience is irrelevant to determining its true or falsity. There's no scientific method is irrelevant for telling us whether that's true or false. But the back fence is white. Scientific method is relevant for telling that. So the back fence is white can increase your knowledge. It gives you information. It gives you content. And so empirical statements are capable of conveying truth or falsity, they're capable of conveying facts about the world. Then there's a fourth kind of language, which let me get my papers straightened out here. There's a fourth kind of language, which the positivists called emotive language. Now, it might have occurred to you that when we were talking about tautologies and contradictions and empirical statements, that doesn't cover all the uses of language. Language is used for a lot more things than just tautologies, contradictions, and empirical statements. There are also questions in language. There are commands in language. There are emotive expressions in language. There are expressions of fear. There are promises. There are all these different kinds of things in language that are not covered by the first three categories. So the positivists, rather sloppily, I think, invented this fourth category that they called emotive language, which is a kind of grab bag, it's a kind of wastebasket to put all the other kinds of language that don't fit in to any of the first three categories. So poetry, commands, questions, all those different kinds of language were all called emotive. Because you see, the positivists thought the main purpose of language, and this was also true of the logical atomists, they thought the main purpose of language is to state facts, okay? And that's really all that we're interested in, is stating facts. And so we can safely ignore everything else that's done in language. Well, we'll see later on that this is now considered to be a mistake by the logical positivists, but this is the way they operated. They're interested in seeing what kinds of language convey information, convey facts, convey knowledge. And so coming out of this was something called the verification principle. For any statement to be empirically meaningful or cognitively meaningful, that is, for it to fit into group C, it must be verifiable by methods akin to those of natural science, right? empirically meaningful. That means that the sentence can state either truth or falsity. To say that a sentence is empirically meaningful doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. The back fence is white. That's empirically meaningful. We know what it means. But it may be true or it may be false. It depends on investigation. So whether it's true or whether it's false, though, it's empirically meaningful. That is, it's capable of conveying information to us. And the phrase cognitively meaningful is more or less synonymous with the phrase empirically meaningful. Now, by this test, and this is where logical positivism becomes really radical, by this test, all ethical, metaphysical, and religious language is cognitively meaningless, though it may have some emotive value. It conveys no information about the world, but may express attitudes toward the world emotionally. Now, see what's going on here. They're saying that, remember how Comte rejected metaphysics, following Kant and so on. Well, the positivists say not only is metaphysics wrong, not only was Hegel wrong when he talked about the absolute, when he posited the existence of the absolute, Hegel was wrong about that. But not only was his statement wrong, but his statement was cognitively meaningless, all right? That is to say, it's neither true nor false, because the positivist asked, how would you verify whether there's an absolute or not? What evidence, what empirical evidence would lead you to believe that there is a Hegelian absolute or there's not a Hegelian absolute? And there's none. So since there's no evidence, we have to say that Hegel's statement is not really a statement, that his statement doesn't convey any information, doesn't convey it truly, doesn't even convey it falsely, okay? So that's the situation that we have there. Well, the situation is the same with regard to ethics, right and wrong. Now, these are the same things that Wittgenstein had a problem with. Right and wrong. Stealing is wrong. Well, how do you verify that scientifically? What empirical evidence is there that could convince you that stealing is wrong? And the answer of the positivist is there's no empirical evidence, because wrong is not something that you can see or hear or test for. There's no scientific method that would enable you to make a decision as to whether science is, whether stealing is wrong. So stealing is wrong. That's cognitively meaningless. Now, it may be a legitimate emotive expression to say stealing is wrong. Maybe that's just an expression of my attitude. To say stealing is wrong is to say I don't like stealing. And that was one of the ways in which the positivists dealt with ethics. There are a few others too. But you see, metaphysics is cognitively meaningless. Ethics is cognitively meaningless. And what about religion? To say that God exists, is that something that you can verify or falsify? Well, the positivist said no. There's no empirical test for whether or not God exists. And so the expression God exists does not convey a true fact. It doesn't convey a false fact. In fact, it's not even cognitively meaningful. It doesn't convey any proposal that could be true or that could be false. It is rather cognitively meaningless. Maybe an emotive expression. Maybe when people say God exists, what they're doing is expressing an emotion toward the universe, expressing a feeling of wonder kind of like Schleiermacher, I guess. But the positivists say that these religious statements don't convey anything meaningful. Now, Christians got very scared of this in the 30s and 40s and 50s. These guys were not just garden variety atheists, you know. These were not village atheists who had their various arguments against the existence of God. They were not just saying that God didn't exist. They were not just saying that there are errors in the Bible. What they're saying is the term God exists is a meaningless expression in some way. We don't even know what you're saying when you say that God exists, because there's no way of verifying whether it's true or whether it's false. Well, that threw a lot of Christians into a tizzy. This was the most radical form of unbelief that a lot of them had run into. Not only is our faith false, but it's meaningless in a way and can be simply dismissed with a shrug.
The preceding program has been brought to you by RTS on iTunes U and may not be reproduced or disseminated in part or in whole for sale or for profit without express written consent. For more information on RTS degrees and programs, please visit us at www.rts.edu or call 1-855-854-6920.